I don't want to hold back the listeners, Tristan, on talking about the tax system, of course, in Singapore and what those rates look like. Because when I was over there last, I was doing a bit of deep diving into the tax system, and if my memory serves me correct, I believe the highest personal tax rate was 22%, was it? Or somewhere around there?
Yeah, around there. So like it used to be 22, now it's 24, but it's only 24 on the very top end. So greater than $1 million, you'll be on 24%. But the rates are pretty good in the sense that the 22% tax rate kicks in at 320,000 Sing, and if you are on, this is the amazing thing, if you're on about 320,000 Sing, your average tax rate's something like, if you average it out, something like 11% or 12% or something like that. So it's pretty good in that sense.
Welcome back to the Winners Playbook. Josh here with a special guest making his first appearance on the show, and that is Tristan Perry, who is the Managing Director of Tax and Accounting at 𝗪𝗵𝘁 Financial Private, based in Singapore. A lot of Aussies look at Singapore for career growth, lifestyle, and a different tax system. And today we're going to be getting into why people make the move, what to sort out before you leave Australia, and how the tax rules differ in simple terms, and the smart ways to set yourself up when you land. And of course, if Singapore has been on your radar, then this chat will help you avoid common mistakes and make better decisions. Tristan, great to have you on the show, mate.
Thank you, Josh. Thanks for having me.
No problems at all. And I was obviously over in Singapore about a month ago now, when I seen you last. What's the climate like in Singapore? It's still as it was when I was there? It was raining a bit that day I met you, actually.
It's basically the same every day, which is time goes really quickly in Singapore. So it's pretty much 100% humidity, hot, sunny in the morning, afternoon shower, repeats. And if it rains in Singapore, it is good because you can basically just take cover somewhere, and generally the rain is over in about 10 or 15 minutes, and you can carry on with what you're up to. So it's rare that we get those kind of days that rain all day, but Singapore good at the moment. We just had the Grand Prix last weekend, so
How was that?
Well, it's really buzzing. It was epic. Some big stars came. I think Elton John was up here. There's a few other really good bands as well. Smashing Pumpkins, I think, as well. But it was the city was absolutely chock-a-block. So
I can only imagine. Wow. I can only imagine.
The days of the Melbourne Grand Prix as well, which is always a bit of fun.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, I always miss the Singapore climate when I get back to Australia, because right now it's the weather's getting better. It's starting to turn, of course, change of the season, but it's still a bit cold and windy. Top of sort of 20. I think next week we've got 28 degrees on Thursday, so I'm looking forward to that. But very much jealous of the Singaporean climate, that's for sure.
Yeah, look, it's definitely the other extreme. It's when you've got to walk from the train station to the office, doesn't sound like very much, but you can do a lot of damage to your clean shirt. It looks like you've had a shower on the way to the office or something like that. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I can understand. Well, before we jump into the topics that we're going to be diving into, of course, you're actually an Aussie, Tristan. So it'd actually be good if you can maybe just touch on a bit of your own personal journey, and then what sort of led you to setting up and being situated over there in Singapore.
Yeah, okay. Look, background is I born in Canberra, raised up there. I moved to Melbourne in my sort of mid-20s, and I was in Melbourne for about 10 years. I'm a chartered accountant, so I was working in a chartered accounting firm there called Mutual Trust, which was a sort of we span off an ex-Arthur Anderson practice that's emerged into Mutual Trust. So I sort of had a really good Melbourne lifestyle for a period of time, enjoyed the random weather, got severely addicted to good coffee, as we were doing in Melbourne. And then my lovely wife got an expat transfer and said, "Hey, do you want to come, or do you want to stay?" And I said, I better come. So I'm what you call a trailing spouse. And there's sort of not not many tax accountants up in Singapore because, tax accountants up here in Singapore are Singaporean tax accountants, not Australian tax accountants. So I'm sort of one of very few up here. And, since I've been up here, I've sort of jumped around a little bit. So I now run my own practice called 𝗪𝗵𝘁 𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂 of regular clients that we lodge tax returns for about 500, and then we do a lot of Australian expatriate advice, so things like tax residency, capital gains tax, coming to leaving Australia, coming to seeing returning back to Australia, restructuring, that sort of thing. So, for all intents and purposes, it's just a busy, I run a busy little tax practice, like any other accountant would in Australia or Melbourne, but we just specialize in expatriates. So most of our clients are dotted all around the world.
And is your role predominantly working with Aussies? So you solely are working with Aussies, or do you actually have clients from other countries, like coming from the UK and things like that as well?
Good question. Most of my clients are Australian citizens just based offshore. I do have a number of, for example, foreign investors. So, Singaporeans, Malaysians, Chinese, honkies that all own Australian properties that need, some Australian advice and that sort of thing. And I do occasionally have these really interesting, mysterious calls with sort of global migration specialists where they just connect me to the most interesting people all over the world that want to get a second visa and consider Australia as an option. So I had one that was like from Vietnam the other day that was they owned an aquarium superstore. So they were if you want pet fish, they're what people to come to in Vietnam. They were considering a visa in Australia. So I think I scared them a little bit with the Australian tax regime. I guess most Aussies were pretty used to it, but and I've spoken to someone in Hawaii a couple of weeks ago that was a health food supplement. They're also looking to move to Australia. So there's a lot of the work I do is that Australian, the Australian angle of basically just dealing with life in Australia and the tax system.
Yeah, cool. And if we then look at like what most commonly Aussies are asking when they're reaching out to you initially, like what are the most sort of common themes and questions that you're sort of battering from Australians when they're looking to come over into a new country like Singapore?
Yeah, look, there's I guess there's kind of two ranges of questions. So for expats who were sort of based here, either just based here or considering, there's questions like can I send money back to Australia, which is an easy one because there's no tax on capital transfers, but and that's probably just because not necessarily the case with all countries in the world. Some countries, if you transfer capital into there, it can get caught up as caught up and classified as income. Can I keep contributing to super? That's probably one that you get a bit with your clients, Josh. So will that jeopardize my Australian tax residency situation? Can I invest in the Australian stock market without it being taxed when I'm a non-resident as well? So the short answer to that is yes, you can, because basically assuming that you're based in Singapore, which is a capital gains tax-free environment, and you invest as a non-resident, then it's capital gains tax-free to you during your time offshore if you buy and sell. So there's a few of those little nice little factoids, you could call them. Other things like there's always a lot of discussion about the residency piece. So the Australian tax residency rules are still very much dealing with the same residency rules that we've had for 80 plus years, 1936 Tax Act. But some of the, I'm sure yourself or some of the listeners would be aware that the government was reviewing the personal residency rules and have, quite a number of years ago. So we have these legislation stuck in Parliament, and we're also wondering what 𝗹𝗶𝗳𝗏 is going to do about it, whether he's going to push it through or not. So, it's the infamous 45-day test. So they're, looking to simplify the residency rules rather than, have them as complicated as they are at the moment. So I definitely spend a lot of time talking about residency with clients because big issue with leaving Australia or returning to Australia.
Yeah, and could you maybe touch on, if you're all right, Tristan, with like the high level of how that actually works ceasing your residency in Australia, like just high level, the common traps or things people don't consider. So if I'm looking at getting out of Australia and I genuinely want to set up in in Singapore. Like, how does that work? When am I a non-tax resident? How does that work?
Yeah, okay. Really good question. So, got the three main residency tests, which is the resides test, the domicile test, and the 183-day test. And the important thing is all three, you need to effectively pass all three tests in order to be able to exit Australian tax residency, which is why it's complicated. So resides test looks at the resides in accordance with the Oxford Dictionary. So very grey in the sense of, you say here's a definition and we've just got to apply that definition to your lifestyle. But the main sort of main factors they look at is going offshore with a long-term intention. So if you accept an expat assignment, it's going to be at least 2 years. 2 years is like this kind of magical number that kind of gets used in the background. Setting up a house. So and by setting up a house, I mean renting a house/apartment. I mean renting an apartment, longer-term lease. So it's at least 12 months with a with a view to continue that 12 months. Having a long-term employment pass or visa when you're offshore as well. So you've got that kind of intention. Having a job as well. Of course, the two go hand in hand, and also giving up your home in Australia. That's a big one. So and by giving up your home, it doesn't mean selling your house, but just means renting it out. So it's off the cards for you. So generally, a lot of those. If you're moving offshore and you're ticking all those boxes, it's pretty clear, exiting residency position. But it's where clients have a spouse and kids that they're leaving behind in Australia and they're heading offshore. That's when it gets more complicated. And we've really got to lean into things like the day count. So, conservatively speaking, tax lawyers are regularly telling me that, sort of less than 45 days is kind of a magic number if you've got a spouse and a house in Australia. And that's meaning if you are moving offshore, you've only really got your annual leave days plus a little bit more that you can go to Australia in order to keep the taxman satisfied that you've left, that you're not generally living in Australia. So that's sort of the main one. There's even things like if you're going offshore traveling for a year. Now, this is an interesting one. So if you say, I'm going offshore traveling for a year, I'm going to lock up my house, I'm not going to be in Australia for 12 months or longer, am I still a resident? And generally the taxman would say, yes, you are, because, you haven't established a home, somewhere else in the world, and you're only going for 12 months. So for those people that are looking to take sabbaticals and they want to generally exit, Australia for tax purposes, you've got to have that long-term intention, and you've got to have a place to live offshore as well, even if it's a villa in Bali. So, it's one of those things that, I say to people, if you're going to do that, go and rent a basic villa in Bali or Phuket, somewhere that's easy to get, one that won't cost the world, and leave some stuff there, use that as your base, and have a longer term intention.
Yeah, it's obviously a very complex area. Do you ever actually come across people that have moved over and haven't gotten any advice whatsoever, and they just, they got sort of upped and left and took off? Like, does that happen?
All the time. So it's one of those,
Yeah.
like with a lot of people, the natural progression is, you're working in a job and they transfer you offshore, and, and generally most people, they'll have a house in Australia, they'll have a mortgage, and they think, hey, I better rent this out to get some rental income to help pay a mortgage. So automatically by renting that out, you've given up your house. So that's ticking one of the boxes. And generally employers will move you offshore for at least 2 years. So, it's sort of, there's a lot of things that happen naturally without too much trouble. But, there is definitely messy situations where people, leave their spouse behind, just sort of play it by ear, and they come and see me after the facts have happened. And unfortunately, we can't jump back in that time machine to, change the facts. So, like all things, I'm preaching to the converted here, Josh, but, it's always important to take advice, financial, tax, other, before you make these big life decisions.
Yeah, for sure. And then talking to why people move to Singapore, like one of the big motivating factors I see a lot of people consider is obviously the tax side of things, which we'll definitely talk about and break down. But one thing I've definitely found interesting from coming over to Singapore and really getting a feel for it is there are a lot of other factors. Although it is a very low tax environment, there are some other factors that need to be considered, like cost of living, schooling, lifestyle. I learnt over there that, getting a car, I forget what it's called, but you have to pay, I think it was like 100,000 Singaporean to get a 10-year permit or license to drive a car, and then you got to get your car on top of that. So there's a lot of other factors that you got to take into account. Do you want to like briefly touch on some of those main ones? Because I think schooling over there as well is not cheap to consider. So
It's not. So look, so as an expat, you can't, or it's very difficult to send your kids to local school here. So, and if you do manage to get them into a local school, it's not necessarily the school of you're choosing. It might be, on the other side of town, and a real hassle to get to. Very different schooling system to, Australia as well. So, it might be a bit of a shock of, an Australian, school age child jumping into a Singaporean school, which are quite strict and, very much a kind of a, rote learning style, to kind of fit into that. So, international schools, are generally, for 99% for expats, they are super expensive. So that's always a big, a big factor. So it's kind of, it's akin with your top private schools in Melbourne, basically. So, all the way through from nursery all the way through to year 13, if you're going all the way through. So it's a big factor. For example, if you've got two kids in the Australian International School and they're in year seven or in high school, you're looking at, upwards of, call it 40 to 45,000 per child per year. So straight away in the budget, you've got to kind of think, do I have enough money put aside to is it going to be worthwhile? Yes, we're paying low tax, but can we handle the cost of living? Rental over here is a bit expensive as well. So it's doing your cash flow is super important, and it's very much a landlord's market over here. So the rental market is purely by rental supply and demand. So if the landlord turns around and says to you, yes, you've been paying, call it 7,000 or 8,000 a month, you've got a 2-year lease, and they say for the renewal, it's doubling, it's going up to 16,000 a month.
Wow.
There's no way you can go, as in you can either pay it, you can try and negotiate with them, or you got to move. And if that's what they want to charge, that's what they can charge. Like if sometimes it's a motivation to get their apartment empty as well, but other times they just feel that there's someone else out there that'll pay more. So there's those kind of, apartments are difficult. Like you said, cars are quite expensive. So, one of the reasons why Singapore roads are not too bad is because it's expensive to own a car here. So, cross the border into Malaysia and the roads are choked up and there's cars everywhere and everyone's got 2 or 3 cars. But in Singapore, most people, if they're lucky to get one car, if not, most people catch public transport, which is pretty good here. So, that they're the sort of factors to consider. But,
Yeah.
if you'll indulge me for a bit longer, some other important factors that I always talk about with moving to Singapore. So your spouse. So that so let's say you've got a job but your spouse doesn't. That's a really big consideration, because for your spouse to actually get a job over here can be hard to actually get the rights to work. Do explore that avenue before you come over here. There are flexible visas. There's one called the '1pass for executives. So that's for people that are on more than 30,000 a month, and all the actual salaries are kind of talked about on a sort of a monthly basis here. So more than 30,000 a month, you apply for this thing called the *1pass, and your spouse automatically gets what we call, or can get what we call, a letter of consent, which is a right to work, and that's flexible because it's a right to work anywhere on any salary. So that's means that they can and they're quite valuable. But if you come over here, like most people like myself, on an employment pass, that doesn't come with any spousal work rights, and your spouse has to apply for a work right in their own name, and that might be challenging.
Yeah. No, that's really good to know. And talking about that cost of living, I found quite similar when I was visiting Dubai a couple of years ago, because again, Dubai, people think of it as like a tax haven, and a lot of people talk about moving and going offshore, but I found that it was incredibly expensive the time I spent over in Dubai. I wasn't there a long period of time. It was a couple of weeks, but it just felt very expensive. And I guess it's a matter of where you shop and where you eat and things like that as well. And it's a similar experience I felt in Singapore as well, when I was staying on Sentosa Island for the first part of my travel on one of my trips, and that was expensive.
Yeah.
But then we got off the island, and going into some of the markets and things, and eating out there is just like kind of eating in at a shopping center here in Melbourne. It didn't feel like that at all. So I think it did feel expensive, but it's also a matter of just kind of your lifestyle choices that you're making at the same time. But with the housing one, because you've been there a little while, Tristan, like that sort of real pushing up in rental prices and property prices at the same time. Can you sort of pinpoint it, when did that trigger? Because I understand obviously a lot of Chinese came in and a lot of offshore money come into Singapore some years back. But did you see that, and was that quite obvious for everyone to see when that occurred?
We did. So Hong Kong was to blame for some of it. So as a lot of Hong Kong expats left Hong Kong and moved to Singapore, because a lot of the Hong Kong, Singapore, the roles are a little bit flexible between the two countries. So suddenly we had this influx of expats from Hong Kong. Suddenly, the old supply and demand curve gets messed around. There's more demand, less supply, so the price naturally pushes up. So that did have a big push on the expat market, because there's certain apartments that expats would like more, which is a bit more room, a bit more green space, maybe close to the ocean. And typically they'll demand a high price, and it, if you're on a 2-year lease, you're on the 2-year lease, so that's all fair. But as soon as that lease renews, that's when a lot of people, just end up just getting priced out of their apartment. So I know we were on Sentosa for a period of time, which was good. And strangely, the way the market happened, we entered Sentosa in just before COVID, when the market was down there, so it wasn't very popular because it was seen as being a bit outside of town, a little bit, not as convenient. There's no train system out on Sentosa, and and generally Singaporeans don't elect to live out there. It's mostly expatriates and foreigners. So at that point in time, the market was soft, so we managed to get a good deal on the rental. We managed to renew, luckily, just before the market went up, and we just paid a little bit more. But then after that, basically our rent doubled. So we've had so we just went, 4 years in Sentosa. It's and it feels like the Truman Show. As in gated communities, golf carts. Like, I guess if you're comparing it to Australia, it's a bit like Gold Coast. The Gold Coast gated communities with the little man-made lakes and stuff everywhere. And then we just decided to move into the heartlands, which is great. So we've got like a big old apartments, and exactly said, there's definitely options to live cheaply out there. So we can eat local. You can get pretty cheap meals if you want down at the local hawker centers, or if you want to eat Western, then you just got to pay a bit more. That's all.
Yeah, sure. No, that's really good. And I guess we can't really complain too much about a rental crisis here in Australia on prices, because rent's doubling. That's a lot, and so that's big. We definitely haven't had that in Australia, although it has gone up, quite a lot, but it hasn't certainly doubled that quick. Because I don't think the leasing rules even allow you to do that in Australia. You can't go up and exponentially just double someone's rent at renewal, as much as some landlords may want to do that. That's not how it works. There's a bit more protection over here. I don't want to hold back the listeners, Tristan, on talking about the tax system, of course, in Singapore, and what those rates look like. Because when I was over there last, I was doing a bit of deep diving into the tax system, and if my memory serves me correct, I believe the highest personal tax rate was 22%, was it? Or somewhere around there?
Yeah, around there. So it used to be 22, now it's 24, but it's only 24 on the very top end. So greater than $1 million, you'll be on 24%. But the rates are pretty good, in the sense that the top marginal tax, the 22% tax rate kicks in at 320,000 Sing. And if you are on, this is the amazing thing, if you're on about 320,000 Sing, your average tax rate's something like, if you average it out, something like 11% or 12% or something like that. So it's pretty good in that sense. The other factors that people that Singapore is famous for is capital gains tax free. So and that's amazing. So that's amazing for founders. So quite a few Aussie founders have moved up to Singapore when their businesses are starting to grow. moved up, disconnected from Australia for tax purposes. So generally, became an Australian non-resident for tax purposes, started living in Singapore. And as a result, when their business pops and they enjoy that, that gain, capital gains tax free. But the important thing is the deemed sale, which, I know you're very aware of it, and, something to make sure the listeners are aware of it. So, as an Australian tax resident, you're taxed on your worldwide income, worldwide assets. We're famous for that. When you leave Australian tax residency, you have a one-off election to make a deemed sale, where you effectively elect all your non-property assets and disconnect them from Australia, and pay, pay it's not really hypothetical capital gains tax, but pay the capital gains tax at the market valuation when you exit Australia. So for most people, it's it's your share portfolio. So you've got a share portfolio in Australia. Let's say you leave Australia on the 10th of October. You effectively on that day you look at the share market and say, okay, here's the value of my whole portfolio on this day. In your tax return for the 2026 financial year, so the year that we're in, that's where you declare the change of residency date, and you'd also book that capital gains tax event, which is an election. And it's important to note it's an all or nothing. So you can either do it or you can't, but you can't pick and choose your shares. So if you've got some shares that aren't doing so well and others that are doing well, you can pick it. You've also got the ability to look a little bit, to act, with a little bit of time on your side. Because let's say that you step offshore today on the 10th of October, and this is in the 2026 financial year, so you're not going to lodge your 2026 tax return until July, August, September 2026. You could do your share count then, and you'll be able to see whether your share portfolio is going up or going down. If it's going down, you may elect not to deem sell it, because you might want to at some point, flip that portfolio, crystallize that capital loss, and use that later for tax planning purposes. Or if it continues to go up, then you say, hey, let's book the deemed sale, pay a bit of capital gains tax, and then it's happy days from that point onwards. No more capital gains tax on my portfolio. Yeah, and that includes things like business interests. So as we're talking, so if you do have a share in an Australian company, it's running a business out of there, you're moving offshore as the shareholder, you can also deem sell that. But it's a complicated discussion for a lot of founders, because maybe there's a lot of value in their company, but they got no cash. So it's kind of like it's got no.
You got to pay the tax in some way.
Go pay the tax. Yeah. So that's a big downside.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And one thing I found really interesting when we were starting to explore the expat market offshore is that if I'm a non-resident, I'm say based in Singapore, and say I want to come back to Australia in 5 or 10 years, which I think is quite common, that most people generally come back at some point in time. My understanding there is if I'm investing in, say, just regular ETFs, managed funds, share market shares, whatever it may be, this doesn't include property. But basically what you were saying before is you can still then be investing in these companies and assets back in Australia on the share market. And throughout that point in time, once you recommence your residency, the cost base would basically reset, if that makes sense. So you're investing offshore. Let's just say, for simplicity, I bought $200,000 of CBA. Not that would ever be the case for a client of ours, but let's just say we did that. That doubled over 5 years, and then I come back to Australia. That doubling or that gain is essentially ignored, and I could recommence my tax residency in Australia, sell it the next day, assuming it's hasn't gone up in value and changed from when I returned, and sell it with no tax implications whatsoever, because the cost base would reset when I start my tax residency. Is that correct, Tristan? Have I got that right?
Yeah, correct, exactly. So you can, let's an example of someone that had a portfolio, they deem sell the portfolio, that continues to grow. They might continue to invest. They might have some dividend reinvestment plans going on as well. So they continuing to buy. Call it 5 to 10 years later, they re-enter back Australia exactly whole portfolio takes a mark-to-market valuation, and that's in your cost base. The only thing to be wary of is the 50% capital gains tax discount, because that is a particular provision that's the 12-month period is tested on the entire holdings of the portfolio, so not your residency point. So let's say you sell it, you sell your portfolio 6 months into your new residency situation. You've got 6 months worth of gains. Yes, you would qualify for some 50% capital gains tax discount on that, but VHO look and they say, hey, well, Tristan had his portfolio for 7 years, and 6.5 of those were as a non-resident. Therefore, he can only get, in a proportion, 6 months over 7 years times the 50% capital gains tax discount. So it'll be quite a low portion. So generally what I recommend to clients is when they do re-enter Australia, they've got a portfolio of shares they want to hang on to, we just restructure them. So we drop it into a new family trust, or if it's not in a family trust, we put it in anyway, or we swap it between husband and wife, just something that'll give you a hard reset, including that 50% capital gains tax discount.
Yeah, and that's, we won't go too deep down the rabbit hole there, but I've got a client that's I've got some clients in Dubai, and they've structured through a family trust, even though they're offshore now. And I think part of the consideration there was the directors had to be still based in Australia, or the corporate entity attached to the family trust. So they basically have their parents who are still in Australia as the directors of the trustee company associated with the family trust. And then you can just change that once my clients would come back to Australia. Is that commonly how you would have people structuring, or is there other ways of doing that?
Yes, sometimes you have to be careful with the offshore trusts is the residency piece. So and the question always is, I'm a non-resident, but is my trust still a resident? So things to note is, okay, so if you're the individual trustee and you're a non-resident, so the trust will then be a non-resident trust, so that's all good. But if you've got an Australian-based trustee company, Australian companies are always residents of Australia for tax purposes, and no matter what. So that resident trustee, could jeopardize your trust and keep it as an Australian tax resident. So that's the sort of things to think about there. So generally people are fairly lazy with their structuring when they're offshore, because hold stuff in your own name, there's no capital gains tax in your own name. So do you need to put stuff into a structure for tax planning? Absolutely not. Structures that are popular, and I know when you're up here, we're having a bit of a chit chat about them, is the offshore investment accounts. So these style accounts, important to be wary that fees and a lockup period are completely controlled by the financial advisor. So if you're going into one of these kind of offshore investment accounts, which do have genuine Australian tax advantages, you just need to really scrutinize the fees and the the lockup period, because as you'd be well aware, lockup products in Australia I think they're illegal now. And they have been
gone.
And has been for quite some time. So there are still elements of the Wild West which exist out here in kind of expat financial planning land that you need to be wary of. Is yes, it's a tax structure, but do you just end up paying a lot of fees and investing in some crappy stocks or crappy managed funds to get tax advantage? So at the end of the day, the tax advantage doesn't really matter, because you haven't made any money anyway. So
getting poor returns, and then that's exactly what we seen, Tristan. Like when we were looking over in Dubai a couple of years ago, it was exactly that. A lot of these investment bond structures, and then you looked underneath the hood, there's excessive fees, there's a lockup of money, massive commissions on the way in. I actually seen and spoke to a lot of advisors when I was over in Singapore, and some of the commissions I was told about blew my mind as to what advisors were getting on the front end. And that's where I see actually quite a lot of opportunity for firms like ours that are exploring the Singaporean market. Is the Australian advice system, through all the regulation it's been through, it's actually come out the back end of it. It's in a really good place. And we've looked at the UK, we've looked at Singapore, we looked at UAE, we've looked at the US. Australia, from our perspective, seems to be far ahead for the advisors that are doing and giving advice in the right way. So I think there's definitely like a lot of opportunity, particularly in markets like Singapore, for advisors that want to give the right advice where it's goals-based, it's fixed fees. There's no hidden commissions hidden away that clients don't know about. It's just really open and transparent. I think there's a good opportunity there. But of course, I don't think that tide's going to change overnight, because people in Singapore are so used to dealing in a certain way with their advisors who don't maybe explain how they're getting paid, when over in Australia, it's the opposite. It's like, it's the first thing you know about is, hey, these are our fees. It's a fixed fee. This is how it's structured. There's no kickback here. And as simple as that. I'm sure you've probably seen plenty of that.
I have, yeah, I have. And the system still needs if more work done on it. I definitely agree with that. But it's and look, the old school advisors are slowly being pushed out, because slowly the market is waking up to these changes, which is great. We do have some good advisors over here, but there's for every one good advisor, there's probably a number of bad advisors, unfortunately, that are pushing these lockup products. So there's definitely room for you guys to come over here and shake things up a bit. I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't want to gloss over what we were talking about before, Tristan, around like the no capital gains tax in Singapore, which is amazing, because when you consider, Australia, the highest marginal tax rate, 47%, and that kicks in when you're earning only over $190,000. So there's just no comparison. And you look at the highest marginal rate, you said in Singapore, 24.5%. Australia's virtually double that, and no wonder why so many people do consider moving offshore, particularly for business owners, because if you look at when you're going to get out of your business and you want to liquidate or succession in your business and pass that on, you're paying humongous rates of tax here in Australia. I don't know, is there an actual jurisdiction that has a higher marginal tax rate than Australia that you're aware of, or do we take first place, which is not a good first place?
We're definitely up there. I think some of the other European countries, or if you get on the wrong side of the US tax, I think if you sometimes the state tax plus the federal tax in a US tax system in the wrong situation can hit you pretty hard. But we're definitely up there with one of the highest tax rates in the world. Like a typical strategy that I always talk to expat clients to consider when they're up here is they move up to Singapore, they've got their family home, that they're renting it out, it's probably got a big dirty mortgage on it that they're slowly chipping away, and then they start earning a bit of money up in Singapore, and they say, hey, what should I do with my money? And from a tax point of view, and I would obviously talk to someone like yourself for financial advice, because I'm not a financial advisor, but from a tax point of view, it makes sense to retain your mortgage for the negative gearing benefits. So you start collecting some losses. They'll roll forward and be used eventually on your return to Australia. So give you a nice big tax-free or big chunk of tax losses you can use to reduce your salary and wages in the future. And then with your spare money, basically just build up a portfolio. So whether it's and exactly as we said, whether it's an Australian-based portfolio or an international portfolio, but that is exactly as you said, capital gains tax-free in Singapore, income tax-free on dividends and personal investment income. So, you're not paying any income on the dividends either. And that kind of keeps building up in Singapore. And then just before you're about to go back to Australia, take your money and cash it and dump it on your mortgage. So, try and, 5 minutes before you're about to return to Australia, you've just put this big chunk off your mortgage. Happy days. You can go to the bank and, renegotiate, get those loan payments down, and life's, a lot easier, from a cash flow point of view in Australia. Plus, you use your time wisely. So those sort of strategies, I'm always talking to clients about that, because, get some tax losses and, knock down the mortgage kind of thing.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think I will have to chat to you about my residency status in future, Tristan, because the way that you're outlining that sounds amazing to me. What about, I want to touch on before we close out on some other items, the non-resident tax rates. So a common example you probably see would be, so they're over in Singapore, building up their wealth, etc., as we've spoken about, and maybe they've got some properties back in Australia. So they've got maybe multiple investment properties, and they've got some share portfolios that they may have disposed of, but they're still holding on to them. They're producing dividends back here in Australia. So can you talk a little bit about like the non-resident tax rates? Because there's no tax-free threshold in Australia on, the first 18 to 200 that you earn.
Yeah.
So you're basically taxed on $1 in Aussie when you are a non-tax resident, even though all of your stuff in Singapore can be low tax or no tax. over in Australia, you're getting hit with those non-resident tax rates on your investments. Do you want to briefly touch on that?
Yeah, I'd love to. So things like investment income, Australian source investment income, does touch on a bit of withholding tax. So, for example, if you've got if you've got cash in the bank in Australia and you're earning some interest on that, that's suddenly subject to withholding tax at 10%. And that's something that can be used, for expats that are, investing in, for example, mezzanine finance, building, those sort of construction loans, because they can basically earn a return on that and only get sort of taxed at 10% withholding tax. So that does get used as as an advantage. Dividends. So unfranked dividends, if you're investing in buying stocks and getting some unfranked dividends paid, taxed at 15% withholding tax. If you're in Hong Kong, that's 30% because there's no double tax agreement. And fully franked dividends, effectively you keep the cash, lose the franking credit, don't have to do anything else. And then if you're receiving a managed fund, we've got to kind of dig into a little bit further. So if there's capital gains in the managed fund, that there's no tax on that, of course, because you're offshore. Foreign income, no tax on that. And if you've got the old, what we call the non-primary production category, which is that may be taxed at that 30% tax rate that you're talking about for non-residents. Property income. So property income, if you're negatively geared and you're generating losses, well, there's you're not going to pay any tax on those. They just accumulate, and they accumulate forever. So they just keep rolling forward until they're used. But if you do have a positively geared rental property, that's when you're going to start paying 30% from $1. So you've paid off your mortgage, you've got a small mortgage. Always worth considering a depreciation report. So if the house is built after 1987, or you've had major renovations, go to a depreciation report provider, get that report, and that'll help you. And if you're still in a position after all that, you've got positive taxable income, super contributions. So you can still be able to make those concessional contributions each year to knock off that profit in the rental property. So make the concessionals, tax at 15% within the fund, but you're saving 30% on the outside, and you're topping up your super too. So not a bad thing.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I actually had a client, funnily enough, about 4 or 5 years ago, I reckon, came back from Singapore, was there quite some time, hadn't made any contributions to their superannuation, and then was able to take advantage of the carry forward rule because they hadn't made any contributions for quite some time. So they sold an investment property on return and had a huge capital gain. So I think from memory, between hubby and wife, they put in well over 100K, maybe close to 150 combined, and claimed it fully as a tax deduction because they hadn't been taking advantage of any super contributions whatsoever whilst they were overseas. So that's probably a pretty common one that a lot of expats would be able to utilize because of they're probably not making a huge amount of contributions when they're overseas. Do you see that one?
I do. That's a really good concession, that one. So that's when the government brought that in. I was all for it. So we do talk about that quite a lot for clients, especially for planning those capital gains, or even just returning to Oz. Right? If you return to Oz, you're back in, earning top marginal tax rate, and let's say you got a bit of spare cash flow, so you might as well make some lump sums into some super and knock down your taxable income a bit in the years after returning.
Yeah, I agree. And before we close out, Tristan, I wouldn't mind just briefly touching on something that we spoke about when I was over there, which is the foreign pension sort of setups and options and how they work. Because we were touching on how a lot of business owners and wealthy individuals have obviously moved over to Singapore. And I think one of the richest people in the world, Ray Dalio, one of the best investors in the world, Ray Dalio, has actually set up his family office in Singapore, and I'm sure there's a lot of other people that you're aware of that have moved over. Could we lightly touch on that foreign pension setup and how that can be utilized, and how you guys as a business actually do help business owners and investors utilize something like that?
Thank you. Yeah. Look, very, very happy to chat on that. So, with most clients, you come to Singapore, you make some wealth when you're here, and then something happens and you need to return to Australia. So whether it's a planned return or it's like, my parents are getting old or the kids need to go back to school, there's that reason to go back. And the foreign pension fund is one of those structures that can be used to effectively leave assets offshore. So how it works is it's a Singapore trust with an Australian compliant trust deed as a completely independent trustee. So, different different to our, Australian discretionary family trust that we're all used to having in Oz, where, a lot of the time, you're the director of the trustee company and the like. So how this works is, the structure is classified as a foreign pension fund, and it aligns with the ATO rules for that. So how it works is, effectively, you can park, for example, a business asset in Singapore, like shares in a company, return to Australia. That company continues to pay dividends. It's received by the foreign trust. Now, because it's got that independent trustee, it's got central management control outside of Australia, and it aligns with that foreign pension fund legislation. There's no kind of attribution of the profits to you in Australia, because it's sitting in a pension fund. Once you reach retirement age, which is 55 and retired, or 60, you can then start taking the drawings. And how it works is it segments income and capital. So from the point that you return to Australia, effectively the value of the fund at that point in time just gets segmented. And let's say it's $2 million to pick a number. So let's say you've got $2 million worth of capital. Internally that continues to be invested. So that's growing, earning dividends and the like. The earnings get segmented as the income, and effectively you've got $2 million of drawings that you can draw down on your pension fund, completely tax-free. Once you've gone through the drawings, you've then just left with income that can then either be taken at marginal rates, and you can kind of drip feed that to manage your tax rate, or you can push that into a self-managed super fund at 15% as a foreign pension transfer. So not a bad structure, actually. That it's a little bit costly to set them up, just because of the you're dealing with a completely licensed and registered Singapore trustee, so you need to pay them to look after your trust for you. But at the right levels and for the right assets, it's a great vehicle.
Yeah, and I think we loosely spoke about it would be probably 5 mil and above of sort of assets of investment where you'd say this might start coming into the picture. Would that be fair?
Correct. Yeah, exactly. Just to make it worthwhile, incurring the costs and the like, because, on the other side, you're competing with thinking, okay, if I did bring this back to Australia, I'm going to pay capital gains tax, and it's 23.5% after the discount, right? So you kind of always got that in the back of your head. So, 5 million seems to be about that number that's that works for a lot of these investments. Either that or the style of investments, if it's like a hedge fund or something like that, that's a bit less flexible.
Yeah, amazing. Because it can really complement, the Australian tax system, which is constantly being meddled with by the government over here. And we're talking about Division 296 tax. That's that's there, and the 3 mil and above threshold. And I think the superannuation system, it's where it's, I think, a little bit scary for some young Aussies in terms of going, loading your super up when you're young, because the government is just constantly changing the rules and access and the tax treatment. And now it's only $2 million you can have, and it's tax free. And now the cap threshold's coming in for Div 296 if it all goes through, and the 3 mil threshold. And then there's the tax on unrealized gains, which is crazy. So it probably makes it all a bit more appealing looking at some of these other options offshore, wouldn't you say?
Completely agree. The unrealized tax thing is, I think we're one of only 2 countries in the world that has unrealized tax. The other is one of the Scandinavian countries has got it on one element of their tax system, but nowhere else in the world has unrealized gains. So it's I'm guessing the government gets greedy thinking about that nice. How many trillion in the super pot, Josh? You probably have this on the.
Yeah, I think it's a couple of trillion. Yeah, I believe it's a couple of trillion, and it's no slowing down with all the mandated contributions. So
exactly. Yeah. So I can see why they're always tempted just to meddle with it just a little bit, just to help the bottom line for their parliamentary budget.
Yeah, no, we try to steer away from government talk and politics on here, so we'll continue with that. But they don't do themselves any favors. That's for sure.
Exactly.
Let's say that. But Tristan, this has been an awesome conversation, and we're going to bring it to a close. Before I do that, because we'll post up your details through the podcast and share that all around on the notes after. But if people want to reach out and speak to you, what's the best way to reach out and have a chat?
Yeah, look, I'm always happy to have an intro chat, no cost. So I've got a little a link that I could share with you that's easy just to book in a meeting. I am in Singapore. I'm in Singapore, so I'm Singapore hours, which is 3 hours behind Melbourne, but I always happy to have a chat to Aussies, hear what's going on and hear what you're thinking. If there's any kind of wisdom I can help with potential considerations for a move to Singapore, or even if you're already in Singapore and you just want to have a chat about some tax planning pieces. I've spoken to a lot of clients over the 10 years I've been here. I'm lucky in that respect, but I've always got a lot of knowledge to share, and happy to connect you to the right people if I can.
Yeah, amazing. Well, I really appreciate that, Tristan. It's been an awesome podcast. I think we've covered a lot of topics in this short period of time, mind you. So, of course, any of the listeners, if you're getting value out of what we're talking about, please leave a review. Give us 5 stars on Spotify and Apple, and always follow along for more. Check the show notes. We'll put all of Tristan's details in there as well. And always remember as well, what we are talking about here is general information only. So, of course, if you want to get your own personal advice and you are considering things exactly of what we have been speaking about in these podcasts, you definitely want to be speaking to the right professionals before you do so. But really appreciate it, Tristan, and hope to speak to you again soon, mate. And I'll see you in Singapore when I'm next there.
Thanks, Josh. Appreciate the invite for the show. It's been fun.
Amazing. Thanks, Tristan.
Thank you, mate.
Disclaimer. The information contained in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into account your personal circumstances. Please head to the show notes if you wish to book in a free 15-minute call to discuss your personal situation.